I'm actually quite glad that I get to speak on the second week of our debate around the climate bill, because it gave me a chance to go and read and listen to the other contributions that deputies have put forward, which has been very interesting. It's quite a spectrum of responses to the bill. For some, the bill goes too far, and there's a feeling that it might pit communities against the inevitable reforms that will be required by the very real changes brought about by global climate change. And I would agree with some of those concerns. I think that we do have a challenge in terms of the just transition and in making this work for farming. I would say that Ireland is not unique in a reaction to some of this change around carbon emission reduction and the fear that it will impact on the average worker and on those who farm the land most. For others, the bill doesn't go far enough, and there are concerns around governance not being robust enough, and that not all government departments would be involved. I would also take those concerns seriously, and it may be that we need to calibrate the reporting or the governance around it as the bill takes shape and is actually working. If this isn't an all-of-government project, it's not going to work. My concern in all of this, though, is the impression conveyed by both sides of the House, from both sides of the argument, that this is an all-encompassing initiative and that this is almost like a full stop in terms of our country's approach to addressing our role in climate action. And I think for me this climate bill is in fact an answer to, or if not a pathway away from, a lost decade, where inaction and I have to say calculated political indifference saw us at the bottom of every table of progressive climate action. And let's be honest, there are many deputies in the House who are not particularly bothered and don't particularly care about climate action or the impacts that climate inaction might have on their constituents, and that is their prerogative. But it's really important that every side of the argument and every side of the House recognises that the decade of inaction and indifference that we've just experienced has left the Irish nation singularly vulnerable to the impacts, the economic, the social and the environmental impacts of climate change. Climate change, whether you believe in it or whether you care about it, isn't a slow train coming at the Irish people. It's a very fast train coming down the tracks at us, and due to our international agreements and to the extreme weather events that we're experiencing in our own backyard now, we are going to have to deal with it, and we cannot ignore it and we cannot escape it any longer. And this could have been easier. In the last 10 years, we could have reached out to farmers to gradually phase in land management and biodiversity measures, and we didn't do that. Now we're going to have to do more in a shorter time frame, and we can't pretend that that will be easy or without worry for small and medium farmers. In the last decade, we could have been talking to communities about pooling their resources and capitalising on the very real opportunities that we see other communities in the EU capitalising on around community ownership of renewable energy sources. We didn't do that either. Now we'll spend millions on retrofitting homes and millions on retro-engineering community energy instead of being ahead of the pack on public investment in green technology. We could have spent the last decade looking at high carbon emission industries in specific communities and targeting them for a just transition and support so that the average worker would be able to upskill and benefit in a very real way for the new jobs that will be created by the inevitable change that's coming in all of our industries in response to climate action. We didn't do that. And now our ability to retrofit our homes and to install solar power and to run district heating will be slower than it could have been because we'll struggle with capacity in the sector. So we shouldn't be proud of the last decade because that was a political and societal choice to ignore the need to plan for our children's future and to plan for their survival. And we decided not to do that. This House decided not to do that. And the new task will be harder and more painful and more expensive than it needed to be because of that choice. So this is a very important bill, an incredibly important bill, and it sets out internal Irish structures to finally address climate action. And it's a suite of measures that sits in parallel to other things that we must act on now to safeguard our future and plan for our children, not just to survive, but to thrive. So first on that list of parallel issues would be the issue of biodiversity. Ireland is in the middle of a biodiversity crisis. We have widespread species collapse. We have river pollution and mismanagement. We've just seen the burning of our beautiful national park in Killarney, and the loss of habitats in a widespread way across the country. The curlews, the corncrakes, the barn owls, the bats that I used to hear above my head when I grew up in Limerick, those used to be common around Ireland, and if we continue along the current path, future generations won't enjoy that. It's now time to consider the recognition of the rights of the Irish people to nature as part of their right to live in an environment consistent with human dignity. For the families who are battling rising floodwaters and for the children up and down this country, the incredibly high amount of children in Ireland who are struggling with asthma across our towns and villages due to low air quality, I think it's fair to say for them we may have reached a tipping point where the degradation of our natural capital may now be impeding the human rights of Irish residents. Secondly, Ireland must become a leader in global climate agreements. Our efforts to meet net zero must be complemented by adaptation and resilience measures, and the mobilisation, and this is really important, of climate financing for countries that haven't developed modern infrastructure. We give out about the infrastructure in Ireland all the time, but we are incredibly privileged here. We live in a well-developed country, and many countries around the world do not enjoy that type of infrastructure, and we need to work with them to ensure that the move towards climate action doesn't disenfranchise them. The issue of emissions from farming is in fact a global one, and I would put it in this bracket, the second bracket of global climate agreements, because farmers feed the world. And the world is going to have to reverse the recent unhealthy move to meat-heavy diets and return to a more balanced diet, which existed just a generation or two ago. We have no target for herd reduction in this bill. But the reality is in Ireland, we could reduce the herd by more than 70% and we still wouldn't have to export beef or import beef to eat beef here. What we're doing in effect at the moment, by not addressing this, is onshoring carbon emissions from other countries so that they can eat beef. We will have to pay the fines on those carbon emissions. And so in effect, the Irish taxpayer will be paying the environmental fines for somebody in Essex or in Surrey to eat a steak. Import or export, this is a global community issue, and we're all going to have to eat less meat. We're going to have less livestock just to survive. Thirdly, Ireland in 2020 had an interesting year. We placed people in significant roles in finance within the EU. We had Mairead McGuinness placed as EU Commissioner on Financial Stability, Financial Services, Capital Markets Union. It's an incredibly important role. And we saw our own Minister Paschal Donoghue placed as Chair of the Eurogroup. Now, it is time that instead of acquiescing to the global move towards tax reform that President Biden has been citing in recent days, that we use our considerable international presence, as a small country, maybe our outsized international presence, to lead reform, because there can be no climate justice without tax justice. And finally, we must actively lead within the UN on the CERI initiative, the CERI initiative, which has three objectives. One is the UN recognition of the human right to a healthy environment with specific reference to children. The second is the creation of a general comment from the Committee on the Rights of the Child as it relates to the environment, and a decision by the parties to the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child to clarify and advance fulfilment of the children's right to the environment through an optional protocol. Last month, at HRC's 46th session, a core group led by Costa Rica issued a statement calling for states to engage in a consultation process on the recognition of the right to a healthy environment. 69 countries supported that call. I'm very proud to say Ireland was one of them. We should now progress that with them and act with them to make sure that that happens. Ireland should now sign the Declaration on Children, Youth and Climate Action, launched at COP25 in Madrid. This is an obvious area of leadership for Ireland, and it builds on the Cuan Gesh pledge, which was pioneered by Ireland and the Marshall Islands in just 2019, so not so long ago. It gives and it places young people and children at the heart of climate decision making. UNICEF wrote to all New York missions on Earth Day this year to ask them to progress that pledge. Ceann Comhairle, after our lost decade, those are the initiatives, and that is the place for Ireland to now lead on climate action.